So have you ever known something to be absolutely true, like with just total undeniable clarity, but you found yourself completely unable to explain it or prove it to someone else?
Oh, yeah. That is incredibly frustrating.
Right. You have this concept perfectly formed in your mind, but the moment you try to externalize the thought and put it into words,
Yeah.
it completely falls apart.
It really does. And I mean, what makes it worse is how modern society tends to treat that inability to explain things.
Exactly. Like if you can't articulate it, or better yet, put it into a spreadsheet or some logical proof, the default assumption is that you simply don't understand it.
Yeah, we operate in this culture that fundamentally equates the ability to measure a thing with the validity of the thing itself.
Oh, that's so true.
Right. If an insight can't be neatly packaged into, a data point or demonstrated on demand, it's often dismissed as just a void, or at best, a vague emotional state.
Which is such a dismissive way to treat human intuition, let's be real.
Yes.
But what if that inability to explain isn't a lack of understanding at all? What if it's actually a completely different but equally rigorous kind of understanding?
That is the big question.
Yeah, and we are diving into exactly that today. We have this fascinating stack of philosophical papers and systems theory excerpts we're looking at.
Centered around a really interesting piece called Logos and System, the Architecture of Recognition.
Yes, and our mission for this deep dive is to decode exactly why this communication breakdown happens. And, to explore a framework that tries to unite measurable science with unmeasurable intuition.
It's a framework that challenges some really deeply held assumptions about what actually constitutes knowledge.
It really does.
We're looking at how vastly different systems of thought, ranging from ancient spiritual traditions all the way to modern computational cybernetics, they all point to the exact same underlying reality.
It's wild. And to get us into this, I want to offer an analogy that really helped me synthesize what these sources are arguing.
I love a good analogy. Go for it.
Okay, so imagine you're standing in a room looking at this beautifully complex antique grandfather clock.
Okay.
Sometimes you understand that clock by taking it apart, right? You measure the circumference of the gears, you count the teeth, you calculate the mathematical arc of the pendulum swings.
Right. That's the measurable approach.
Exactly. But sometimes you just deeply understand the purpose of the clock.
Yes.
You grasp the entirety of its design, its relationship to time, how it anchors the room, and you do all that without knowing a single mathematical equation about its internal mechanics.
That is a highly effective entry point, honestly,
Right.
because the sources argue that to understand our inability to explain certain things, we first have to categorize those two ways of engaging with the clock.
The gears versus the purpose.
Right. They refer to them as empirical and non-empirical knowledge, and they are very, very careful to define the boundaries of both.
Let's start with the empirical, just because that's the one we're all most comfortable with today.
Yeah, the domain of science.
Exactly. Empirical knowledge is the gears. It operates through what the texts call externalized outputs.
Right, it's hard data.
Yes. It's measurable, repeatable, and externally verified. I mean, the whole point of empirical knowledge is to translate an observation into a form that can be shared between two independent observers.
So if I drop an apple, it falls at a specific rate.
Right. You can write down the math for that rate,
Mhm.
hand me the paper, and I can drop an apple and see the exact same thing.
We've completely externalized the knowledge.
Yes. Empirical systems stabilize truth by making it transferable, right? They create an economy of shared facts.
Which is incredibly useful. But then the sources delineate the second category, the non-empirical knowledge.
And this is where it gets tricky for people.
It does, because this applies to concepts like love, ethics, purpose, or, what philosophers might call the good.
Things you can't put in a spreadsheet.
Exactly. These are realities that cannot be measured or weighed. You can't put human purpose into a beaker, isolate its variables, and reproduce it on demand in a lab.
But, okay, if I play devil's advocate here, or at least channel the inner skeptic that lives in all of us,
Sure.
this is usually the exact moment where someone says, well, if you can't measure it or prove it, then it isn't real knowledge.
Right. They say it's just a delusion.
Yeah. Or like a personal preference masquerading as truth. If I claim I know for a fact there's an invisible, intangible dragon living in my garage.
The classic invisible dragon argument.
Exactly. That's technically non-empirical, but it's also complete nonsense. So how do these texts separate a profound non-empirical intuition from just, making things up?
That is the critical threshold of this entire framework. The texts argue emphatically that non-empirical knowledge is not vague, and it's certainly not arbitrary.
Okay, so what's the difference then?
The difference between a profound intuition and a delusion comes down to internal verification through structural coherence.
Structural coherence. Let's unpack that.
Right. A delusion like the invisible dragon lacks structural coherence. It doesn't connect to the broader relational web of reality. It's just an isolated, arbitrary claim.
Oh, I see.
True non-empirical knowledge, on the other hand, is known directly because it maps onto actual underlying patterns in the world.
So you verify it not by demonstrating it on a chalkboard, but by recognizing how it organizes a vast network of other experiences.
Exactly. It gives meaning to the whole web.
So it's about perceiving the web, rather than isolating a single thread.
Yes, beautifully put.
Which brings us to the core problem of why we can't always speak our minds. The text introduces this concept called the expression gap.
Yes, the expression gap.
Yeah, the argument here is that the limitation we feel when we can't explain a profound realization, it isn't a glitch in our brains.
No, it's a limitation of our tools.
Specifically language.
Right. We have to consider what language and measurement actually are. They are mechanisms designed to handle discrete outputs.
Meaning they chop reality up.
Exactly. They function by chopping reality into little manageable separate pieces so we can literally hand them to each other.
But reality itself isn't a collection of separate pieces.
No, it's a relational totality. A complete interconnected web of meaning.
So it's like the pipe is simply too small for the water.
That's a great way to put it.
When we force a non-empirical understanding, like that deep structural recognition of the grandfather clock's ultimate purpose, into an empirical form like vocabulary words or data points, it fragments.
You're experiencing a totality, but you're being forced to output it through a narrow sequential bandwidth.
And you can know it perfectly, but the moment you try to push it across that expression gap, it breaks.
And this is where the cultural bias you mentioned earlier causes so much damage.
How so?
Well, when a piece of knowledge can't be successfully pushed across that gap and demonstrated empirically, society treats it as if the knowledge itself doesn't exist.
Right. They say, you didn't show me the data, so you're making it up.
Exactly. And the sources argue this is a fundamental category error. The knowledge is fully intact within the observer.
It just doesn't survive the translation into an empirical system without catastrophic loss of its context.
Exactly.
So if we accept that, if we possess valid, structurally coherent knowledge that simply refuses to be communicated or proven through empirical language, what do we call the act of holding on to that knowledge?
This is where the text gets really interesting. It takes a word that carries a lot of cultural baggage and gives it a rigorously specific definition.
And that word is faith.
Yes, faith. And we really need to strip away the modern discourse around that term to understand what the authors are doing here.
Because in contemporary conversation, faith is almost exclusively portrayed as trusting without understanding.
Right. It's framed as closing your eyes, ignoring the lack of evidence, and just, hoping a belief is true.
A virtue of the uninformed.
But these papers completely reframe it. Faith in this framework is the psychological act of holding to what one already understands when that understanding cannot be fully externalized or proven to a hostile skeptic.
Oh, wow. So it is in alignment with non-empirical knowledge.
Precisely. You aren't lacking evidence. You possess overwhelming internal structural evidence.
You're just choosing not to abandon that coherence just because it won't fit into the skeptic spreadsheet.
Exactly.
That reframing changes the entire posture of a debate. You aren't defending a blind spot, you are defending a structural recognition.
And the sources link this directly to an ancient concept called gnosis, which typically translates to spiritual knowledge.
Right, but again, they strip away the mystical fog and define it structurally.
They do. They define gnosis as the direct apprehension of generative order.
Generative order.
Yeah, meaning it's recognizing the patterns that produce reality rather than just staring at the outputs. To apprehend generative order is to see the rules of the system, not just the results.
I want to ground this apprehension of generative order in something every day because it can sound overly abstract.
Please do.
Think about your absolute favorite song. Let's say you're walking down the street, a car drives by with the windows down, and you hear literally just the first two notes of the melody.
Just two notes.
Yeah. You recognize the song instantly. You don't need to read the sheet music.
Yeah.
You don't need to pull out an oscilloscope to measure the acoustic frequencies of the sound waves.
Right. And crucially, if those two notes were played on a piano instead of the original guitar,
Or played in a slightly different key.
you would still recognize it. Because you aren't analyzing the discrete acoustic outputs. You are recognizing the relational totality, the structure of the melody itself.
You just know it. Now imagine a skeptic standing next to you demanding, "Prove to me scientifically that this is that song. Show me the acoustic math."
You probably couldn't do it on the spot.
No. But your inability to do the math doesn't mean you're delusional about knowing the song. Your faith that it is the song is based on a direct, non-empirical recognition of its structure.
And this idea of recognizing structural patterns is where our sources introduce a highly unexpected crossover.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
Yeah. We move from discussions of gnosis and ancient spiritual philosophy straight into hard systems theory.
Specifically, the cybernetics of Gregory Bateson.
Right.
This was the pivot in the reading that completely hooked me. Cybernetics is the study of systems, feedback loops, regulation, and how complex networks adapt.
And the text points out that Bateson's cybernetics and the ancient Gnostic traditions are essentially demanding the exact same thing from the observer.
It's wild to think about.
Both disciplines insist that meaning does not reside in isolated facts. In cybernetics, Bateson famously defined information as a difference which makes a difference.
A difference which makes a difference.
Yeah. Meaning arises entirely from relation, difference, and constraint within a system. How do the parts interact? What are the feedback loops?
So, to understand a living system, the observer has to perceive the underlying structure, not just hoard a collection of discrete data points.
Exactly.
Like, if you want to study a forest ecosystem, you can't just weigh all the pine cones, count the deer, measure the nitrogen in the soil, and then claim you understand the forest.
Because the forest isn't just the objects.
Right. The forest is the invisible feedback loops between the soil, the fungi, the deer, and the wolves.
And this highlights the specific danger both cybernetics and Gnostic thought warn against, the danger of empirical reduction.
Which happens when we try to force everything into that scientific method.
Yes. When you try to measure a complex living system empirically, the scientific method actually requires you to isolate variables. You have to pull the system apart to test its individual components in a controlled environment.
But the moment you isolate a variable, you have severed its relationships. You've completely removed its context.
And the papers make this incredible point that context isn't just background scenery. Context is structural.
It's the network of relations that gives any single element its actual function.
Right. If you take a clock completely apart and lay all the gears flat on a workbench, you now have total empirical data.
You can measure every single piece perfectly.
But you no longer have a clock. The system has ceased to exist.
Wow.
What remains can be tested, but the generative order, the purpose and function that made it a clock, has vanished.
So the task of the systems theorist, or the person engaging in non-empirical recognition, is to perceive the logic that holds the parts together before they are dismantled.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the real climax of this deep dive, and the ultimate focus of these sources. We've established that empirical science and non-empirical intuition are both valid ways of knowing.
We have.
But that raises a massive philosophical problem. Does that mean there are multiple truths? Like, are we living in a universe with a science reality over here and a spiritual or intuitive reality over there, and never the twain shall meet?
The sources address this head-on, and their answer is an emphatic no. The error is not in distinguishing empirical from non-empirical knowledge.
Okay, so what is the error?
The error is in assuming that this distinction implies multiple truths. The texts argue there is only one logos.
Let's unpack that term, because logos carries a lot of weight in philosophy.
It does. In this framework, the logos is the singular underlying structure of all reality. It is the universal blueprint.
Okay.
The logos is not divided between what can be measured and what cannot be measured. It is the underlying structure that gives rise to both.
Oh, I see. So empirical knowledge and non-empirical knowledge are not separate realities at all.
Not at all.
They are just different ways of accessing the exact same order.
Yes. Think of it like the source code of a massively complex video game.
Okay, I like that.
The source code dictates the measurable physics of a bouncing ball in the game, but it also dictates the unmeasurable structural rules of how the game's economy or narrative branching works. It is one code.
One logos.
Exactly. And we have to look at how these two modes access it differently. Empirical methods engage the logos through externalization.
They translate structure into measurable outputs.
Right. They stabilize it through repetition, and they confirm it across different observers.
It's drawing the sheet music for the song so someone else can sit down and play it.
Yes. But here is the critical distinction the text makes. This empirical process is not the creation of truth.
Wait, say more about that.
Well, a scientific measurement does not invent the reality it measures. It is simply the expression of truth in a form that can be shared. The method is just a way of accessing what is already there.
While non-empirical knowing engages the logos directly.
Exactly. It does not depend on translation into measurement.
It recognizes structure as it is, prior to its reduction into discrete, testable units. It is hearing the song and recognizing the melody instantly without needing the sheet music.
And we must clarify that this direct, non-empirical engagement is subjective, but not in the sense of being arbitrary or made up.
Right, it's not the invisible dragon.
No. It is subjective only in the sense that it is apprehended internally by the subject, rather than externally demonstrated on a workbench.
So both modes are valid because both are grounded in the same source.
Yes. The logos is singular. The modes of knowing are multiple. Understanding comes from recognizing their relationship, not collapsing them into one or separating them into competing domains.
That is a massive paradigm shift. They aren't competing domains, they are convergent. They reveal different aspects of the same underlying structure.
They do.
But if that is true, why is there so much friction? Why do hard data and human intuition constantly seem to be at war in our culture?
The apparent conflict arises when one mode attempts to imperially invalidate the other. And we see this happen in both directions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When empirical systems treat only measurable outputs as real, they mistake a method for the totality of truth. They look at the gears on the workbench and confidently declare, this is all there is. The concept of a unified clock is a myth.
They confuse the X-ray for the patient.
That's a brilliant way to put it.
And it happens on the other side too.
It does. When non-empirical claims detach from structural coherence, when people start claiming they have spiritual knowledge of invisible dragons in their garages, they lose their grounding in the logos.
And they become exactly what the skeptics accuse them of being: baseless emotion or delusion.
Exactly. In both cases, the problem is not the logos itself. The problem is the misapplication of the mode.
Understanding doesn't come from forcing every human experience into a spreadsheet, and it doesn't come from rejecting all data to live in a fantasy world. It comes from recognizing the relationship between the two.
Yes. The method doesn't create the truth. The task for the observer is to hold both, to see the isolated parts clearly, but never lose sight of the invisible pattern that organizes them.
It really changes how you view almost every debate, doesn't it?
It completely reframes it.
Think about what this means for you as you navigate your daily life. The next time you just know something structurally, maybe you sense a toxic dynamic forming in your team at work, or you hold a deep moral conviction about a decision, but you find yourself completely unable to explain it in bullet points.
Or think about the next time you find yourself in an argument where someone demands empirical proof of an unmeasurable concept like ethics or love or purpose.
Right. You can recognize the expression gap for what it is. The demand for discrete, measurable outputs is simply a demand for a specific language.
Yep.
It is not a demand for truth itself.
Exactly.
You aren't lacking understanding. You're simply engaging the logos directly. Your internal recognition of that structural coherence is a valid, rigorous mode of knowing.
It just doesn't survive the translation into data points.
You don't have to surrender your understanding just because the pipe is too small.
We've covered a lot of ground today, moving from the frustration of being misunderstood to the architecture of reality itself.
We really have.
And the through line is that our inability to speak our minds is often just a symptom of a much larger philosophical bottleneck.
Looking back at the journey of these sources, it is really a profound relief to realize that the empirical and the intuitive aren't enemies.
Not at all.
To see that the rigorous science of cybernetics and the ancient practice of structural recognition both point to the same singular reality.
The measurable gears and the unmeasurable purpose of the clock are both born from the exact same blueprint.
It provides a much-needed framework that allows us to honor both the incredible rigor of the scientific method and the irreplaceable depth of human intuition.
We don't have to choose between them.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to carry forward. We live in a society that is accelerating its demand for data.
Faster than ever.
Yeah. If we continue on this current path, if we insist on building our reality strictly on what can be measured, tested, proven, and put into an algorithm, what essential structural truths are we filtering out?
What critical parts of the singular logos are we systematically forcing ourselves to forget?
And perhaps more urgently, Once we lose the ability to recognize the broader structure, how long until the measurable parts themselves lose all meaning?
That's the real danger.
Because at the end of the day, you can measure the circumference of every single gear perfectly.
Right.
But if you've forgotten how to actually recognize a clock,
You'll never know what time it is.